Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Gabrielle, and this is Kiyomi. And hello and good afternoon. So I'd just like to do a brief intro and talk a little bit about the purpose of JCL's Uprooting Anti-Blackness series. JCL is one of the oldest civil rights organizations in the U.S., and the national conversation on anti-Black racism last year exploded in the wake of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Charlene Wiles, Manuel Ellis, and others. And right now, as you know, we're seeing an alarming increase in racist attacks on our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. And this is yet another manifestation of racism that impacts all communities of color in different ways. As members of JCL, we felt it important to continue this series of conversations as a means to take responsibility and to promote Black and Asian solidarity. So as you enter, please do enter your name, pronoun, and anything else you might wish to share in the chat. One thing I just wanted to share, one thing I've been thinking about this morning, I attended a Stop Asian Hate rally, and I actually saw a couple police officers holding signs that said, "End racism now and stop Asian hate." And I was just kind of thinking about how different that was, what a contrast that was from this summer when I was protesting with Black Lives Matter. And I just wanted to share that because I think it's important to just remind ourselves that, you know, Black Lives Matter is still, Black Lives Matter, you know, even in this time of anti-Asian violence as well, and that we're stronger when we work together in solidarity, love, and partnership with our communities. So I'm going to pass that off to Jess now.
All right, thanks Gabrielle and Kiyomi. My name is Jess. I'm a board member with Seattle JCL. And before we get into our content for today, we just want to ground ourselves with a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, Snohomish, Duwamish, and Indigenous peoples of our local area. As well, we acknowledge the experiences of genocide, forced relocation, ethnic cleansing, and land theft so that we can build our awareness of how racism and settler colonialism have impacts that exist to the present day. We honor the resurgence of culture, economy, and way of life of tribal nations of our local area. And as community members, we resolve to learn from these realities so that we can work toward a more just society. And whether you're joining us from Seattle or elsewhere, we invite you to learn more about the occupied territory on which you reside, as well as the Indigenous people connected to the land. And a great resource that we have here in Seattle is Real Rent Duwamish, which we'll post a link in the chat below. And I'll turn it over to Kyle to give more context there.
Thank you. I'm Kyle Kenosha, another JCL, Seattle JCL board member. We also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that we are in a difficult time, as Gabrielle mentioned, for the AAPI community with the current upsurge in anti-Asian racism. The Seattle JCL has taken a strong stand, and these are statements from the press release that we did condemning anti-Asian racism. And I'd like to underline that really the heart of the statement is underlining that it's about finding ways to oppose racism, no matter who it's directed at, because it has the same roots. Last summer, Seattle JCL and its members participated in support of Black Lives Matter. And this series itself, which started in the fall, is part of the effort to work with our community to address the root of the problem. So we hope that our community members can consider how they can contribute in the fight against anti-Blackness and against endemic racism in general. And we hope this series helps us better understand how to participate in this movement. So I'm going to pass it to Emma, who will talk about some guidelines for our conversation today.
All right, thank you, Kyle. So thank you everyone for attending today's program. I'm sorry, I'm a bit of a hypocrite today. My video is off because my internet is running a little slowly. But I wanted to outline some guidelines for this afternoon. So first of all, you can choose to have your video on or off. but we did want to create a space where we could see each other's faces and be all in this together. So we encourage you to turn on your video if you do feel comfortable. A reminder to everyone that we are recording this session so that it is available to other folks later on. The discussion portions will not be recorded though. All guests are muted, but you will have the ability to unmute yourself during the discussion portions. And if you'd like to pin our speaker today so the video is always large, all you have to do is click the 3 dots at the right corner of their video and then click pin. We definitely encourage you to keep interacting with us and to drop any questions you have in the chat. Some of our team members will be monitoring that. And we go through these every session, but we would like to remind our community of the guidelines for our conversation today. And so going into the guidelines, we acknowledge that this is a space where we welcome both old friends and new friends. Some of you have been with us through this whole series, some of you may be new, but we hope to grow in our relationships together through this program. And excuse me, I'm losing my place. Our long-term relationship management strategy is rooted in the strength of our relationships past, present, and future. And as such, we will continue to maintain intentional dialogue with our attendees before, after, and throughout this discussion series. We're grateful to each and every one of you for being such an important part of our community and for starting this journey of learning with us and for taking your Saturday to be here with us. As we make new connections, we will work to create an intentional and accountable community. And we do recognize that we are limited in our ability to do deep trust building work over the course of just one program. And so for that reason, we are offering these conversation guidelines you see on the slide in place of a trust building and group agreement process. And we ask that you please use these guidelines to help frame your expectations and boundaries for personal engagement in the event. So I am going to go through them really quickly. How to engage in the space together, care for yourself. If you need to, turn off the camera, take breaks, lie down, stay hydrated, do whatever you need for yourself throughout the program. What's said here stays here, what's learned here leaves here. Please don't share people's names and stories without their consent, but please do definitely share whatever you've learned and reflected on from listening to this program and conversing with others. Move up and move back. So if you are someone that tends to share a lot, think about practicing listening. And if you're someone that tends to listen more, maybe it's your opportunity to practice sharing. Share joy in conversation and lift each other up. If someone says something you love, lift it up and celebrate what they're bringing to the table. Share joy in conversation. Be mindful of when you are processing new thoughts and feelings. Stop and consider who's in the room, what your impact might be when you are processing live, and think about who is best to process those thoughts and feelings with. Maybe it's in the room, but also maybe it's a moment to write down your thoughts in a journal to continue to think about. We recognize that active listening is also participation. We recognize that disagreement over ideas happens and that is okay. We recognize that we may experience discomfort. We will always practice curiosity, self-reflection, and an openness to learning. When you speak, speak your personal truth rather than speaking for the group. We recognize that these discussions are a journey and may not necessarily end with a sense of closure today. And then once again, please don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat. And I will now pass it over. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Emma. Really appreciate those reminders for our community conversation guidelines. My name is McKenna Asakawa. I use she, her pronouns. And it's my pleasure to now introduce our guest speaker for today, Ayanna Yonemura, PhD. Ayanna is the author of Race, Nation, War, Japanese American Forced Removal, Public Policy, and National Security. I will drop that link to the book in the chat. Ayanna has been honored with 2 Fulbright Fellowships and a U.S. Civil Liberties Public Education Fund National Fellowship. Ayanna is currently working on her 2nd book, Women, Wars, and Public Policies, From Hostile Shores to Storming Seas, and that's forthcoming from Routledge in 2022. So please welcome me in please join me in welcoming Ayanna. We'll now transition the screen to her screen share, so bear with us for a moment while we get that set up. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, so now hopefully you'll be able to see the first of the slides for the PowerPoint. Before I get started, I just want to thank Seattle JACL. They keep saying how much they appreciate me being here, but I really appreciate the invitation. And I think even more significant is their whole series, this whole series of workshops and all the work that they do. It's very, very heartwarming and necessary and important work. So thank you for today, and thank you also for the big picture. So I decided to call this talk for today, Disrupting Japanese American Anti-Blackness, a Historical and Global Perspective. Oops, there we go. I've divided it up into 2 parts, and there's going to be a lot of opportunity for interaction with your fellow workshoppers, as well as with me if you like. The first part is focused on epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. So we're going to take some time to think about knowledge and start off with some breakout room discussions. And then I'll get into my thoughts on disrupting anti-Blackness with the assistance of this term, epistemology. And some of the ways that I'm suggesting we disrupt this anti-Blackness is by taking a different look at history. So I'm going to give an example from the 1930s and 1940s African-American and Japanese-American history, and I'm calling it a polycultural example. And then another way that I'll suggest that we can disrupt anti-Blackness with epistemology is by using a global lens and then addressing our sources of knowledge with a global lens. So that's part 1. At the end of that, there'll be time for Q&A for the whole full group, everybody in the workshop. Then we'll transition to part 2, which is focused on racism. And I couldn't decide if I wanted to always put the word racism in quotes or not. So we're looking at racism as a term, so it could be in quotes, but then we're also looking at it as, racism that has actually happened, not just as a term. So we'll start out again with some breakout room discussion so you can warm up in a small group. And then I will go over some ideas I have about using racism as a term, as well as our knowledge of racism, to disrupt anti-Blackness. Anybody have any questions or anything I can clarify before we move on? So part 1, epistemology, and again, epistemology is the study of knowledge. So when we think about epistemology, we think about how we know what we know. What are the sources of our knowledge? Or if you want, you can think sources of our knowledge, either one. So here are the questions for the breakout room discussion on epistemology. The first question is to brainstorm about what you know about African American history. And then also to take some time and reflect where you learned that knowledge. Where did you get that knowledge and when? Was it maybe a class in high school and college? Was it a documentary? Was it a previous workshop? For these questions, just like for the set of questions that we'll have with part 2, there aren't any wrong answers, and there's no one single answer, right? So this really gets us into taking full advantage of the fact that we have a group here of around 30 people, and we're going to have at least 30 perspectives that we can pull on and draw from. So however you answer these questions, it's the right answer. The point here is really just to take some time and to reflect, because often in our everyday lives, if we took time to reflect on how we know what we know, we wouldn't get through the day because we wouldn't have time to do that. So here we're going to take a little bit of time out to go ahead and do that. So I'll pass that over to Seattle JCL to start the breakout rooms. And I will use screen sharing. I'll keep my screen sharing up so that people can look at the questions if
Thanks,
they.
Ayanna. I just opened the room, so you should see an invite to join your breakout room on the screen. And we'll repost the questions in the chat as well. It'll be 10 minutes.
I'm looking forward to hearing what came out of the discussions in the breakout rooms.
Me too. All right, welcome back, everyone. Looks like we have everyone in the main room again, so I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Ayanna.
Thanks, McKenna. Anybody like to share some of what came out of your discussions in the breakout rooms? The fruits of your verbal labor? No? Okay, that's totally fine. So,
I can share real quick.
oh, sure,
Sorry,
Eli.
I was trying to get to my unmute button. We were talking about, like one of the things I mentioned is I grew up with a very narrow political spectrum. Like it was either people were good or bad. Like people were either Republicans from the South or like Northern Democrats. And that like dichotomy in my family was like in our group, we were just starting to talk about the difference between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and growing up in my family, they were just sort of on the same level, and like the vast nuance in their politics never really came up. It was like these were Black civil rights leaders, therefore good.
Ah, okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate hearing that, Eli. Anybody else want to share what came up in their breakout rooms?
I think two things I think that were noticeable in our breakout. One is that, in terms of our formal education until maybe college, African-American history was just nearly absent, other than sort of the standard sort of slavery narrative. But the other thing that I think is really positive is that I think that, especially as a result of, recent events over the year, there's a lot of self-learning going on, which I think is really positive.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And there's so many wonderful ways to do that, in addition to our traditional way of reading books. Anybody else?
Hi, this is.
Go ahead, Stan.
Okay, this is Stan from group 2. So the two things I think that we hit on is one, none of us really learned about Black history in school, or very, very superficial stuff. Most of it was done in self-study or, post-collegiate. And number 2 is that a lot of the discourse that we did here was famed Black or white. And it left us kind of wondering, okay, so where do Asians fit in on this? Thank you.
Very true. Very true. Yeah, definitely. I think for a lot of us, and this has been the case until very recently, so maybe people who have recently graduated from school have something, have a different perspective. But for a lot of us, our education was very East Coast centric. And when it came to any mention of race or racism, it was a very much a biracial presentation, a Black-white issue. So California, and the fact that California has been a multicultural state from the very beginning, has been marginalized in the dominant educational curriculum. So that makes a lot of sense what you're saying there, Stan. So certainly I'm going to suggest not thinking within that Black-white paradigm, but actually to adopt a polycultural lens. So polycultural lens is the idea that when we are thinking about a particular topic or exploring history, for example, we do it by looking at how many groups experienced or were part of a certain historical moment. So one of the critiques of the term multicultural is that sometimes multicultural as a term is used to look at groups one after another. For example, in the course of a textbook, you may have different chapters based on different racial or ethnic groups, but that it is not a term that is often being used to promote not just comparing groups, but actually to seeing how the histories and lived experiences of group members are deeply intertwined. So I'm going to suggest adopting a polycultural lens, and I'll give you some examples of that. And then I'm also going to suggest adopting a global lens. So these are ways in which you can add or change your sources of knowledge, as well as the perspective that you use when you're taking in new information, such as the news and current events and all of that. Anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts there? Okay, lots of words here. It's a very crowded slide. So there's a lot that I wanted to say. And I think I was having a hard time choosing this morning as I put this together. So what I want to present from a cultural perspective is some US history. So there are a lot of us who are online with us today who are very familiar with Japanese American history, probably especially Japanese American World War II history. It's probably still the most studied topic within Asian American studies. And what I've done with this slide here is to show some similarities which are very deeply interrelated between African American history and that Japanese American history of World War II. So I want to actually move this here. So I call this raw deals and new deals. Raw deals is the term which many African Americans used to refer to the New Deal. In particular, the first New Deal, which went from 1932 to 1936. So just as a quick refresher, the New Deal was President Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression. It was an enormous quantity of government programs, which the federal government used through FDR's administration to pull out individual Americans, families, communities, but also the whole country out of the despair and suffering, which was the Great Depression. So, when we think about the New Deal, it has a really positive connotation, and we even see that term being used today with positive connotations having to do with the environment. Some people have critiqued the Green New Deal, but the reason why that coin was termed was because the New Deal has a positive connotation, but it did not for African Americans when FDR was first in office during his first administration. And that's because FDR's administration was in itself racist in terms of having prejudices against various non-white groups, including African Americans. Also, Southern congressmen dominated during all of the New Deal. Sorry, I'm just smiling because I see the little waiting room. During all of the New Deal time. And what happened was that there was a group of very powerful people who took advantage of the New Deal programs to really exploit African American vulnerability. So those are those very powerful politicians, also industrial associations, farm lobbies, and by farm lobbies I mean people who own land. Sometimes that could be family farms, but also bigger scale farming. So we might call them here in California growers as opposed to farmers. So you saw these coalition and shared interests of various powerful people in the South who are also powerful in Washington, and they were able to use the New Deal as a way to gain a stronger foothold by further exploiting African Americans. So what I've done with this right-hand column is point out how a lot of what happened in the raw deal, which African Americans experienced, was paralleled in the next decade in the Japanese American history. And that's not a coincidence, right? That's not a coincidence. So we're still talking about the same presidential administration, FDR. We're still talking about very powerful regional stakeholders who were interested in getting Japanese Americans forcibly removed from California, including and especially agricultural interests, those big California growers. In both cases, we also see a lot of euphemisms which were used, including euphemisms related to the term democracy. So more recently in US history, we've seen in US international policy this idea of nation building. This was a kind of a euphemistic perspective in which social control and social reform were really combined by the federal government in the 30s and 40s. So the idea of making a group more democratic went hand in hand with finding ways of exploiting them. But democracy is a language which is used by the federal administration in both histories. Then we also see, of course, the coerced migration as something which the groups share. In the African-American case, you had people who were forced out of their homes in the South because of the economic pressures which they faced as a result of the New Deal. So first of all, with the Great Depression, African-Americans were already suffering. And of course, African-Americans were suffering because of even before the Great Depression, because of the oppressive nature of post-Reconstruction politics, the fact that people really never got their full rights as citizens or as people in the United States. So here we see that intensifying and people being pushed north as a way of trying to survive. And then, of course, we know with the Japanese American example, people were forced to migrate by actually being removed. And we know that there are many examples, including close to where I am right now. I'm here in Sacramento, and we have a whole community here called Florin, where Japanese Americans had established farms, especially strawberry farms, and many people were not able to recuperate those family farms or those businesses. And in both, the USDA played a big role. How am I doing on time, McKenna?
We're doing great. Yeah, thank you.
I don't want to rush through unnecessarily, but I would love to take the time and see if folks do have questions. We'll definitely have a whole Q&A once this whole lecture is over, but I do hope if I say something or rush through some history, which really needs to be clarified, that you give me a chance to do that, because again, there's just so much. I was having to choose what to put on here. So what are the other important similarities here? With the first New Deal, the Raw Deal, we know that African Americans were exploited, and we know that the United States Department of Agriculture, as well as state departments of agriculture, played a role in oppressing African Americans through the guise of the New Deal. But if we read the memoir of Dylan S. Meyer, we'll find that African Americans are invisible in his memoir. So who was Dylan S. Meyer? Dylan S. Meyer is the man who ran the War Relocation Authority. He ran those 10 camps in which, those of us who had family were incarcerated. Most people were incarcerated in those camps. During the Depression, he worked for the Department of Agriculture, both at the local level and then later at the federal level. He worked in places including Kentucky, parts of the country which had African-American rural populations. But somehow when he talks about the Great Depression and also his role in it and working with farmers, Black folks are invisible. So this is the same person who gets his first presidential appointment, by taking on the position of heading the WRA. In both histories, we see that there were accusations by members of the public as well as by politicians, and we might call them special interest groups, that the policies which were focused on these various racialized groups, African Americans, Japanese Americans, were quote unquote communist as well as subversive, that these policies were in some way undermining the United States government. This really happens especially when people perceived that African Americans or Japanese Americans were benefiting from the policies. So even though there are some policies which we now see as highly exploitative or part of an entire historical context of hideous oppression, some people perceive those policies to be positively benefiting the policy targets. So example, in the Japanese American case, had to do with the conditions inside the War Relocation Authority camps. There were racist individuals, members of the public, as well as elected representatives, who felt that the conditions in the camps were too positive, that they were too life affirming. And so therefore, the doings of the WRA was actually subverting the goals of the US government. It's a really trippy and warped way of thinking if that's not how your approach is. Because as I've described the raw deal policies, you might think, wait a minute, that does not helping Black people. So how is it even helping them or empowering them to be subversive? And what is communist about pushing people off their land? And these are not folks who are advocating for African Americans, but there was a lot of interpretation that these policies were actually babying these racialized groups.
Ayanna, I just want to pause there for a second. Looks like we did have a question from Stan Chikuma. Stan, do you want to ask that question out to the group?
Oh, I was just wondering, is Dylan Meyer the same guy who was running the BIA after the war?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Did you know the answer to that, Stan, already?
Yeah, I think I read Dylan Meyer, Keeper of the Camps.
Yes, Keeper of Concentration Camps.
Yeah.
Absolutely, a very, very inspiring book, right? Absolutely. So just for folks who aren't familiar, BIA is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and that was a presidential appointment which Dylan S. Meyer enjoyed after World War II. Absolutely. So I also have written and thought a lot about the Native American connections, but I tried to focus for today on the African American ones, but absolutely. And you know, with the 1930s policies towards Native Americans, you saw the same types of accusations by certain groups and certain politicians that the policies were communist and subversive. So what you're starting to see in the 1930s is that there were policies which were focused on particular groups, which were publicized as being in the interest of those groups to help members of those groups, right? Like evacuating people in the case of Japanese Americans. And because you had those policies which explicitly targeted certain racialized groups, including Native Americans, people then also attacked those policies as being communist because they were then unnecessarily assisting, supposedly, members of those groups. And we also see that it gets taken quite seriously. There is a congressman from Texas who's one of the very powerful Southern congressmen. During the Depression, a congressman dies, and he headed the subcommittee on un-American activities. He made accusations that New Deal policies which targeted African Americans were communist and subversive. And then what we see is that during World War II, Dylan Meyer had to go before Dye's committee, and he had to defend WRA policies because they were under the accusation that they were unfairly helping Japanese Americans and were also communist and subversive I feel like I did something goofy with my PowerPoint here. 1 second. I need to be able to see my arrows. Okay. Okay. So yes, that's kind of just to underline, right? I want to underline it. That in both cases, you had programs ultimately that were oppressive and progressive at the same time. So that really gets us to the second New Deal, which is after FDR was reelected in 1936. And that second New Deal for African Americans also had parallels with Japanese American history. Again, the USDA was very prominent. What we see in both cases is that liberals had more power than they had previously. So in the second New Deal, we see that liberals were able to influence policies. And so we're talking about liberals like Eleanor Roosevelt or Harold Ickes or Rexford Tugwell. These are people who are cabinet level liberals. And also it was liberals who dominated the War Relocation Authority in terms of their political perspective. So, what did that mean? Well, what it meant for the second New Deal for African Americans is that they actually started to see some positive changes, which did improve quality of life. Those changes included jobs, right? Which white folks had been getting all along as part of New Deal policies. Housing. Now, mind you, this housing was segregated. So the opportunity is to have housing. And that means also you have to accept segregated housing. So you can see why I'm saying that these situations were simultaneously progressive as well as oppressive. This is all relative, right? So this is relative to the 4 years which preceded 1936 and to the earlier history. We know, of course, in the Japanese American case, we can see it as an extreme example of being segregated by a federal agency, being completely removed and completely isolated and concentrated in camps. So in both parts, government described, right, government communications officers or propaganda officers, of which there were many, including Dillon S. Meyer, participated in that occupation for the USDA before World War II, which promoted these policies as very positive. At the same time, they knew very well and were very open about the fact that these policies were also segregation policies at best. I think with the Japanese American example, we could even say that segregation is a euphemism. I already had talked about Dillon Meyer's memoir. We did that, right? That was on an earlier slide. So also what we see in both the Japanese American World War II history and in the second New Deal is that there are some acknowledgement of the contributions of these two groups from the federal government. So some acknowledgement, again, is striking when there has been no acknowledgement or only blatant, a blatant dismissal, right, or exploitation. So with the New Deal, Americans' relationship to the federal government changed. And with the second New Deal, that then included African Americans' relationship to the federal government because they did see positive changes in their lives. I mean, including my own great grandmother and great aunt, who as African Americans were able to get employment through New Deal policies. So there's a different relationship to government for all Americans, but also for African Americans. And the influence of the liberals on the federal policy meant that some African American contributions to US history were recognized. And we see that paradox also with federal policy targeting Japanese Americans during World War II. Because the policy was dominated by liberals, Japanese Americans were perceived by policymakers as people with potential, as opposed to as people who were disposable. Any questions or comments or thoughts about that?
I'm curious, I would love to hear you speak to the like how, and this is very much my own framing and maybe you would disagree with this, but to me, the fact that like these quote unquote liberal policies made like social mobility more possible for African Americans and Japanese Americans is like is still maintaining anti-Blackness and white supremacy because it's still upholding capitalism. And so it's like tricking people into engaging in capitalism, which to me is the bottom line. And I don't know if you would agree or disagree with that.
As far as capitalism being the bottom line, that would be, that's a very almost now ancient argument, right? Whether or not capitalism is the bottom line or really the big picture, or whether or not racism is the big picture. So for me, in understanding the US, but even most of world history from 1500 to present, understanding white supremacy is very paramount, and I'm not able to replace understanding racism with understanding classism, but classism has to be part of any comprehensive analysis. So I do actually discuss a lot of classism, for example, in my research and in my teaching. Absolutely, both the Japanese Americans and African Americans had opportunities which led to upward mobility for families and even for entire groups of people. So that's absolutely a case, and that's absolutely a fact. The thing is that, and I'll elaborate more on this, is that liberals believed that non-whites had potential to be more like white people, right? And in terms of class, absolutely, we want to keep in mind that policymakers under Federal Roosevelt came in two different class sectors. One is elite, and then the other is middle class. But there's no working class, right? There's no poor folks who are influential members of the cabinet, because even to be appointed a member of a cabinet, obviously you're part of an elite. So someone like Dylan Meyer had a very middle class background. He was one of those white guys who was the first person in their family to go to college, because he was part of the generation where it started to become a thing for middle class people to go to college, right? And it started with white men. And then there were the elites. So I call the middle class ones the bourgeois brotherhood. And then there's also this elite brotherhood, and they have things in common, and they have differences, very important class differences, but they do all find themselves working together in a liberal and very white supremacist administration.
Oh, I had a quick question. So kind of like, sorry, I'm still like wrapping my head around all of this new information, but so kind of like the gist of the last point though on the slide is that like white liberals, they still recognize like African Americans' contributions and like recognize that Japanese Americans like had potential to contribute as well, but it was still centered on this narrative that to be American is to be more white.
Yes.
Okay.
And white here is a cultural thing, right? So it is a cultural thing, and whiteness that is also interwoven with middle class white American culture, also very patriarchal white American culture, one which there is a particular place of respect for the quote unquote expert, right, who has been college educated. And you know, in my book, I go into detail about the gender and class aspects of the policy background. But what you see with the World War II policies targeting Japanese Americans, because there was so much control over people during that time, is definitely the attempt to remake them, particularly the Nikkei, into white middle-class Americans, not a phenotypical remaking, but this is a cultural remaking and trying to really capitalize, for lack of a better term, on the assimilation, right? And their cultural similarities that they already had, to push them further to be more like the white middle class.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anybody else? Okay. So what I just went through there was this idea of using a polycultural lens to really see not only that African Americans and Japanese Americans are both oppressed or have both experienced the bad end of racism, or that Japanese Americans should participate in taking responsibility for current oppression of African Americans. So instead of those particular arguments, what I'm really saying is these two histories are one and the same, right? These histories are one and the same. You had the same, many of the same ideas, actors, individuals who impacted Japanese Americans during World War II as who impacted African Americans the previous decade, and it's not a coincidence, right? And those are just 2 decades. There's so many other ways in which the histories are deeply interwoven. So now I want to take a look at a global lens, and again, it's also about epistemology, creating more sources of knowledge and different sources of knowledge. What happens if you take an international look? What are the sources of knowledge that appear, and then how does that shed light on the relationship between Japanese Americans and African Americans? So for this, I go to Edward Said, who was a Palestinian who grew up in Egypt. He was a professor at Columbia University here in the United States, and he wrote a very influential book called Orientalism. One of his arguments in Orientalism is that central to European and Euro-American cultures is the idea that those cultures are superior to other cultures. So what he's actually saying is that a major part of European and European American culture is believing that it's superior to other cultures. So this is a very, very important and powerful idea. And I think that it really resonates with a lot of what Seattle JCL members were saying in the introduction when they talked about the fact that both the current upsurge in anti-Asian hate crimes, as well as in the murders of African Americans, are interrelated, right? Because in both cases, according to this ideology, these are people who are inferior culturally because of the ways in which they differ from European or Euro-American culture. Any questions about that? Okay, so let's take a look here. So going on, continuing with a global lens as a way of expanding our epistemology. And we have a quote here. It says, "This nation has placed its destiny in the hands and heads and hearts of its free men and women." So the nation which is being referred to here is the United States. And we can say today that the word free is maybe ambiguous. it's definitely disputable. What does it mean to be free? Yet, according to this quote, the nation's destiny is in the heads, hands, and hearts of these free people. Well, who are these free people? Well, according to this, it's really all Americans who are supposedly free. And then the quote continues, freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. So this is a quote by President Roosevelt, 1941, right? This is on the eve of the US entering World War II. Europe had already been at war since 1939. So there's a couple of things going on here. In this part of the quote, we see that FDR's speech conceals the racism in the United States, right? We know what's going on. We just looked at the 1930s. We know what's coming after the Japanese military bombing of Pearl Harbor. So we know that free really has to be questioned. But FDR also goes on not only to talk about freedom in the United States, but globally. Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. So in this context of World War II, Roosevelt administration had a propaganda war, as did other combatant nations in World War II. And a big part of the US propaganda was to depict the United States as a place where people were free, as a place where people lived in a democracy. And also that the United States was culturally superior to other places because of its political culture, right? Because of its democracy. The United States was culturally superior, certainly to non-Europeans, but even to Germany at this time, because Germany was an enemy of US allies and a place where people were being persecuted. And as an enemy nation, the United States wanted to contrast its US government actors, I should say, wanted to contrast the way it depicted itself with the way enemy countries were perceived globally. So in a context in which there's Japanese imperialism and also Nazis taking over Europe and persecuting people, and of course we're building up to genocide against European Jews, United States wanted to emphasize its difference from that, and that it should be a global leader. Yeah, it's all quite ironic. Any questions or comments or thoughts about that? So let's take a look at the global lens and what was happening during World War II, while there was all these free people in the US and supposedly human rights needed to be everywhere. The United States was an imperialist nation. So during World War II, Rexford Tugwell, who was one of the original members of FDR's cabinet, he was part of FDR's brain trust, was the non-elected governor of Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico was under the power of the United States. So Rexford Tugwell was a non-elected governor of Puerto Rico. He had been Undersecretary of the United States Department of Agriculture, so he was extremely important in the New Deal policies. He ended up being chased out of Washington, not by Democrats, but by Republicans, because he was accused of being communist, and it was really bad optics or bad PR for FDR's administration. But what we know from African history is that many more people were forced from West Africa to what we now call Latin America than actually were brought to what is now the United States. More Africans were forced into slavery in Latin America than in North America. That includes Puerto Rico. So when we think about the African diaspora and where folks of African descent live all over the world, the Caribbean and Latin America are really important parts of it. So what's happening globally? Well, you know, the US imperialism is impacting people of African descent. Britain and other European countries also practiced imperialism and forced African soldiers to fight in World War II on the behalf of the metropole governments or the colonial governments. Italy was using East African soldiers. Italy took over Ethiopia right before World War II, and by using Eritrean soldiers. Eritrean also right there on the Horn of Africa bordering Ethiopia was a colony of Italy. And then we know, of course, allied with Nazi Germany at this time is Italy, right? Two fascist governments. And then we also just looked at policies which gave African Americans opportunities. And those opportunities were to have jobs, were to join the military, were to get housing from the government during a time of horrible housing scarcity. But all of that was segregated, right? And that's why when African American soldiers found themselves in Europe, which is really the origin and the backdrop of US imperialism, they experienced freedoms which they had never experienced before, right? Ironically, they can go there and be at the heart of Europe and experience freedoms they never had before because of the racism and Jim Crow in the United States. So I point out these aspects of Africa and the diaspora to give more global context to Japanese American experiences during World War II. If we look at Japanese Americans' experiences during World War II from a global perspective, and from the understanding that central to European and Euro-American cultures is, that's my chihuahua barking in the background, is that they're superior to others, then halas, thank you, stop it. My dog is bilingual and he speaks Arabic. Just trying to tell him to be quiet. Halas, stop it. Okay, so you know, it's not very surprising. It's still horrific, but it's not very surprising that Japanese Americans experienced the particular federal policies to which they were subjected. You might be thinking of questions or comments, and I'm going to try see if closing my door helps. How does Peter? Okay, sometimes closing the door just elicits whining, so it doesn't necessarily help. Okay, I think the mail is here. Any questions or comments or thoughts? Okay. Anybody want to, how are we doing on time, McKenna?
Thank you, Ayanna. We are a little bit behind time, but so I don't know how you want to craft the second section to accommodate. We're at 3:10 right now, and we are hoping to end around 3:30.
Yeah.
So however you want to readjust, but I think that you know, the content you're covering is really, the pace you're taking it at is important. So thank you.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I'm more, you know, quality is more important than quantity. So why don't we do this as a full group discussion as opposed to breakout rooms? Maybe that would be more helpful considering the time. So the questions that I have posed here is, how do people use these words? How do people use the word racism? And how do people use the word racist? And when you think about what examples there are of racism or of what's racist, what makes those examples examples? And again, just like with the questions about what do you know about African American history and where did you learn it, there are an infinite amount of legitimate answers to these questions. And there's certainly no one right answer, and I don't think that there's even any one wrong answer. Does anybody want to share with us an example of how people use the word racism or racist? Okay, just think about it, right? Oh, go ahead. I was going to say.
Well, I don't know who, well, this is Wendy. I was going to just say that I've had a lot of conversations, and I think racism is more neutralness and objective sounding if we're trying to talk about systems and policies. And I made reference like Ibram Kendi's, on how to be an anti-racist. He always makes this distinction, but it's really tricky when you talk about racist, or because I think suddenly everybody personalizes that. And I've had a lot of conversations where, I have white friends, black, and very liberal white friends, but they do not like the term white privilege because they think privilege, they say, well, many people are privileged, so they take it very personally, and it's very difficult, I think. And I'm always trying to say, we're talking about decisions in the past that result in systems that are racist inherently. Those are things we have to work on, not talking about any personal attitudes. It's difficult.
Thank you, Wendy. That's a very very helpful contribution. Anybody else have any examples, maybe a similar point to Wendy's, or maybe looking at things from a very different perspective? So, what I'll say and what I say in teaching is that people can define and use these words however they want. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not in the business of consensus building. But of course, how we do define those words corresponds with how we also want to address racism, which is really what Wendy was speaking to, the fact that if things feel personal, then maybe people might feel like they have to change their relationship to a system which advantages them, or which they find to be a good system out of their own self-interest. So I'll often talk about how social scientists, anti-racist social scientists talk about racism and racist, and say, this is how they use them. There are other ways of using these terms, and I would want my students to know and understand how social scientists use these terms, regardless of how they may use them, because as you're alluding to, in interpersonal conversation, a lot of times these terms are used to talk about individual bias, or conscious or unconscious bias, or discrimination or prejudice, which is, again, interpersonal. So I want to play maybe a minute of this from W.E.B. Du Bois here. Let's see.
So I guess your girl is a fan now. Daily Heart.
Okay, one sec here. I'm working on it.
This literally does all the work for you.
Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question. Unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. Instead of saying directly, "How does it feel to be a problem?" they say, "I know an excellent colored man in my town," or "Do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil?" At these I smile, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem, I answer seldom a word. And yet being a problem is a strange experience. It dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others, shut out from their world by a vast veil. For the world I longed for,
opportunities were theirs, not mine. Why did God?
Okay, let me get back to the PowerPoint here. So, okay, you should be able to see my PowerPoint. So many people are familiar with W.B. Du Bois, and he wrote those words at the end of the 1800s. So I think that was 1897. How does it feel to be a problem? These words have become very powerful recently and very relevant. I've noticed some publications by Arab Americans who've used that term, and really, how is racism and races defined in this context by Du Bois? If we take Du Bois's thoughts on it and apply it to understanding those terms, that is my question, right? How does this answer that? How does it speak to that? So the Negro problem speaks to Black folks being a problem, right? The racism and the racist problem is a Black problem. So here we have a quote from a great historian who wrote about African Americans in the New Deal. And he was talking about the 1920s as a time of changing policy. And he speaks about Robert Park, who's a Chicago sociologist. And in the 1920s, Park thought of racial prejudice as instinctive. So he thought that being prejudiced was something innate. And then so he believed that racism was something that could not be changed or corrected, even when people interacted with other people of the same, with people of other races. So here we see a 1920s sociologist thinking that racism, being racist or prejudiced, was innate. And this is at the same time that many people believed that being racially inferior or superior was also innate, right? So what we see, though, from our third to the last line here is by the end of the 1930s, Park and most sociologists shared the view that prejudice was not innate. So they get to the point where they think they understand that prejudice was not innate, but they also then did not believe that non-whites were innately inferior. We're not innately inferior because we're culturally inferior, which means we have potential. It means we can change, we can quote unquote improve through assimilation. So Robert Park was very important to the War Relocation Authority and to Dylan Meyer, who followed him and went to a conference on race at the University of Chicago during World War II. And here we have a quote about the Japanese problem from Meyer. He says, "Let's not deal with this problem as Hitler would handle it under his Nazi regime, or as Tojo would deal with it in Japan. Let's do it the American way." So a few things going on there, right? He's promoting certain optics about the United States. He wants to push forward with his assimilation project. He does not want all Japanese Americans to remain incarcerated during World War II. So he's putting out there the importance of emphasizing the distinction between the United States policies and the policies of US enemies, such as Japan and Germany. Let's do it the American way, right? He's implying there's something not only different, but better about the American way. And that is, in his mind, the American political culture, which is superior to not only non-whites, but in this case, even to Germans. So I wanted to show you Du Bois' thoughts on racism as a problem, Meyer's thoughts on racism as a problem. Of course, he was part of that whole change amongst liberal sociologists and social scientists in the 1930s. But another way of understanding racism as a problem is it an individual problem or is it a systemic problem? And this is what a lot of the heated discussions today are happening, I think, especially as Wendy referred to, when we think about systemic racism, I was trying to highlight it. When we think about systemic racism, that means we have to take into consideration unearned advantages to whites, right? Not only undeserved disadvantages to non-whites, but there are correlating unearned advantages to whites. And even though we are not in a time in which it is popular, and the dominant thinking of our time is not that non-whites are innately inferior, we are still in a time in which central to European and Euro-American culture is the idea that those cultures are superior. So that then gets us into thinking about what are our understandings of history, what about ideas and cultures and languages which have evolved historically as part of white supremacy, as well as the ways in which racism is institutionalized and systemic. So if you see racism as a systemic problem, that means you have to actually change issues of privilege. You have to actually change institutions, change textbooks, you know, as Kyle has worked on, change people's understanding of history. You know, you could wave a magic wand and we could all be prejudice free. And then we go back out into the world, and it doesn't mean we'll be in a racism free world, because the racism is then in our institutions, as well as our, you know, our ideas of history. You know, we can think about Thanksgiving just as one. So I want to conclude, because I do want to stop talking and hopefully hear from other folks. So here's just some of what I went over as far as ideas of interrupting and disrupting anti-Blackness. So I really would like to hear from other folks' questions or comments or thoughts. And I know Seattle JACL also has concluding words, so I need to make sure that they have time.
Thank you, Ayanna. I'm actually going to suggest, I know we're nearing the end of our time here, but I know how much our participants enjoyed their breakout group time. So I'm wondering if folks are okay just going maybe 5 minutes over, if we can go ahead and split into breakout groups one last time so you can reflect on some of the learning that just happened. And maybe I'll repost those last couple bullet points that Ayanna just shared about her suggestions for dismantling anti-Blackness. And we can just talk about how that landed for you and what you're processing. Does that sound good to everyone? Okay, great. I will split you back into your groups right now, and maybe we'll come back just after 3:30. All right. Welcome back, everybody. I think everyone's in the main room again. I'll turn it back over to Ayanna to see if you have any closing thoughts, and then we can turn it over to our team to take us home.
I just want to say thank you. I got to join one of the breakout rooms, and thank you, McKenna, for suggesting it. That was awesome. We're talking about some of the emotional stuff about which I have no answers. And I, you know, look to people, look to others, the psychologists and the healers for that. But I just really appreciated some of the deep things that people said and shared.
Thanks so much, Ayanna. Kyle, do you want to get us set up with our last slide? Oh, you're muted. Thanks so much.
There we go.
And I'll turn the mic over to Jess.
All right, so thank you everyone for showing up today. We just want to give a quick little update about our next session here. It again will be with Dr. Yonemura for our second session on Saturday, April 17th, here over Zoom on the same time from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll also be sending out an evaluation, just a post-workshop survey, answering the following questions below. What does today's session make me want to learn? What might be important for the community to be aware of? And what questions do you have about the next topic we might be able to answer? And we know that through this event, there may have been more questions than answers. So we really ask that you provide your helpful feedback through this survey. And with that, we just want to thank you again for being here, and we hope to see you on April 17th. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jess, and another just huge thank you to Ayanna for this incredibly informative session. We are so grateful for you, Ayanna, and thanks to everyone for joining us for this today.